scientist.
What would you like me to say?
Okay, sure.
Good.
Can I borrow a pen as well? Can I borrow a pen?
Sure.
Let's start it. Then thank you for everyone coming. That's our draft of speech. And then today we are welcome Dr. Maxton-Lee come over to here again to give us the speech. And then we have the schedule is about you give us the talk about the draft with the students and lecturers and then the professors over here. And then we will have the interview together. And then you will have the discussion with the students about half hour. Okay. And after that, we will have the lunch dinner time with the informal chat with other faculty members. You can ask questions, you can ask your questions. And this is our fourth short list for this year IPCS new opening. And then the topic for the Dr. Maxton-Lee will be Covid-19 in Taiwan. Time is yours. You can speak.
Very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Please, yes.
So, 大家好。我很开心跟你们介绍我的简报。那不好意思，我的国语讲得不好，所以我需要用英文来介绍，好吗？好 great. So I'm very happy to be here today. And actually, I've been looking forward to this presentation for weeks because I want to share something with you that I'm really excited about. And that's COVID-19 and Taiwan. Because in 2020, there were some really important lessons learned by Taiwan about lessons and opportunities for climate leadership. 2020 was a very bad year for a lot of countries outside Taiwan. But in Taiwan, things were different. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how Taiwan's lessons and experience can actually help with the fight against climate change. Now, climate change, as you all know, is a very big and serious and complex problem. A lot of people don't yet understand how serious and how complex it is, or how urgent. Other people understand that, but they think that the problem is so big and so complex that there's no way that we can find a solution for it in the time that we've got left. But actually, there is a solution, and it's one that can take us to a much better place where we live in balance with nature, and we have a better balance also for ourselves. So, this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about climate change and what's happening now, because a lot of people think that climate change is something for the future. It's something for their children or grandchildren. And I'm going to show you in the first few slides a series of pictures, photographs, of climate effects that are happening around the world now. So I want to show you with that this is a problem that is not for the future, it's a problem for today, and it's a problem for us. Then I'm going to talk about why societies are not responding as they should. It appears to many people as if global society is going generally in a better direction. There are some really interesting sounding ideas and innovations, impact investment, technologies like electric vehicles, recycling, awareness is generally rising around the world. And so it looks as if things are generally getting better. But actually, those innovations are much too small and they can't be upscaled quickly enough to deal with the very complex and very large problem that is climate change. So I'm going to explain why, and then I'm going to talk about barriers to change. I'll then talk about what is needed, and then I'll talk about lessons from COVID-19 and opportunities for Taiwan. All right, climate change, what's happening? This is a forest in Germany. Forests are very dear to the hearts of most Germans. It's very important to the German psyche. But they're dying. And they're dying because temperatures are rising, it's getting hotter, and it's getting drier. So many forests are suffering from heat stress, and they're suffering from drought conditions. Summers are hotter, winters are also warmer. One of the effects of that is that insects are not dying off as they previously did. And so that's causing problems for the forests. Storms are more violent and more unpredictable, and so that's causing problems as well. And so for a whole bundle of reasons, forests are dying. And this is not only a problem in Germany. This is happening around the world. In the Amazon, parts of the Amazon are also suffering from heat and drought stress. And they're also dying off in patches, in parts. And that then causes a knock-on effect because the trees then release the carbon that they've been storing into the atmosphere, and that then feeds the climate change problem. This is a river in southern Germany. This is the southern Rhine. And a couple of years ago, water levels fell very low because it was too dry. And that meant that the freight traffic, the ships, couldn't get up and down the river. And my husband and I were living in Switzerland at the time. And this had a direct economic effect for us that we experienced because a lot of the ships carry fuel. And because the ships couldn't get up the river, they had to send the fuel by road instead. And that's more expensive. So the way we experienced it was that the price of petrol and diesel at the filling stations went up. But that also had a knock-on effect on the price of food. And so climate change is actually having direct economic impacts as well as low water and weather effects. This is a glacier in Switzerland. And a few years ago, people tried to cover the glacier with tarpaulin, with sheets of tarpaulin to stop it from melting, because it was melting too fast. And again, this is not something that's only happening in the Alps or in Switzerland. This is happening around the world. And again, that has a lot of other impacts. It's causing water shortages sometimes. It's causing changes in water flow. Sometimes there's too much water. And it's affecting the reflectivity of the ice. So the albedo effect is being changed, which means that less heat is being reflected back up into space, which means that the warming effect is increased again. as the temperatures rise, permafrost is melting in the Alps, in the mountains. And that means that the ground and the rock that has been frozen is melting, and that's changing the structure of the rock. It's changing the structure of the mountain. And a lot of the most popular climbing routes have been closed in recent years in the Alps because they're not safe anymore. And a few years ago, a chunk of rock the size of a tower block fell off the side of the Eiger, one of the iconic mountains in Switzerland. So really, again, non-trivial effects. This is a water reservoir in Chennai, in India, where in 2019 it dried out and it left 11 million people without water. Now, some of the reasons for that would have been infrastructure problems, lack of maintenance, overpopulation, but this is a part of a long-term trend. And within 10 years in India, many of India's largest cities will be without groundwater. That includes Chennai and Delhi. This is Mozambique. And in 2019, Mozambique doesn't usually suffer from cyclones, but in 2019 there were 2 cyclones that came through within the space of 6 weeks, and that displaced or affected 1.3 million people. And this was the worst natural disaster in 20 years in southern Africa. This is Hong Kong, and the damage that you see here to a modern tower block, this is not caused by fire, this is caused by a typhoon. So it's not just places like Mozambique that are being very badly affected by violent storms. We might think that some countries are less able to deal with the effects because of infrastructure or development issues. But here's Hong Kong, which is very well used to storms. They have a very active typhoon season every year. And yet with all of their modern infrastructure, with all of their excellent storm monitoring and planning, they were still taken by surprise, actually twice in that year with 2 megastorms. In 2018, 6,000 fires destroyed almost 8,000 square kilometers, including the largest fire in California's history. And just to put that in context, the fires last year in Australia were 6 times worse than these fires in California. And so there are a lot of effects from the fires that we might not immediately think about. This is what it's costing. So this is just in the US. In 1985, it was costing the United States $240 million to fight fires, forest fires. By 2017, that had gone up to $2.4 billion. So in that time, the cost of fighting forest fires just in America had gone up 10 times. And this is just one economic cost. This doesn't count the economic costs of homes that have been destroyed, farms that are destroyed, factories, offices, businesses. It doesn't count the cost of vineyards that have been burnt, which takes tens of years and more to establish. It doesn't account for the cost of relaying roads that have been burned. It also doesn't take into account the emotional strain of dealing with, the fear of dealing with fires and the increasing frequency and the emotional trauma of having to leave your home. And it doesn't also account for the animals which are killed. So all of this is effects that are being seen already. And this is what people are doing to try and react to some of those threats. So this is Los Angeles, where they're painting the roads white to try and reflect some of the heat back out of the cities. In New York, they're painting some of the roofs white for the same reason. You can see this kind of as an act of desperation. People can feel that this isn't just an anomaly anymore. It's not just a one-off event. This is a real threat which is affecting their lives, and they don't know what to do about it. This is the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia, where, because of rising temperatures, again, the permafrost is melting, and as it melts, it's releasing greenhouse gases that have been trapped in the ground for tens of thousands of years. And this is a methane bubble. So this image here on the left of the screen is where you can see the gas is expanding and it's rising to the surface and it's creating a bubble. And then over here, this is what happens when it explodes. And it leaves this huge crater. But the crater is not the problem. It's the fact that it then releases all of that methane into the atmosphere. And again, that then causes a warming effect. And as you know, methane is 25 times more potent in terms of warming potential than carbon dioxide. So this is happening because of climate change, but it's then adding to the climate change effect. All right, bring it closer to home. This is Taiwan. And we know that temperatures are rising. And we can see from this chart, this goes from 1910 to 2017. And the average temperatures are rising. But they're not only rising, they're also increasing the rate at which they're rising. And actually, so it's getting hotter, but it's getting hotter faster. And Taiwan is actually above the global average in the warming rate. So global average temperatures are 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Taiwan is 1.4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Other effects, it's getting drier, so we're suffering from drought conditions. We're having fewer typhoons making landfall. Last year, we didn't have any typhoons making landfall. Sea levels are rising, and there's higher rain intensity as well. Rain, when it does come, is often less easy to predict, and it's much more intense. So these are things that are happening now, but it's also causing problems for planning. So by 2050, 1,400 square kilometers of Taiwan will be underwater. That means that nearly 3 million people in Taiwan, so about 4% of the population, in Taiwan's 6 largest cities will be affected in some way by sea level rises or storm surges. Now, this is a picture of a map of Taipei. And the blue areas are the areas that are expected to be underwater in 2050. And the red areas will be affected by storm surges. And so here's Taipei railway station, main station, which will be flooded by 2050. Here's the Parliament building, which will be flooded by 2050. So it's important to remember this is not a direct result of Taiwan's emissions, but it does affect planning. If anybody's thinking about buying property in Taipei, then they probably want to think again. Okay, let's talk about the long-term view. What does this mean in the long term? This chart shows 65 million years of planetary history. And the part that I'm going to talk about is this section over here, the last 500,000 years. So here we are, last 500,000 years. And this scale on this side of the chart, the 0 shows the average for the last 500,000 years. So that's kind of our baseline. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were about here. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, for about 2,000 to 3,000 years before that point, we were at a high point in temperatures compared with the average for the last 500,000 years. There'd only been 2 other points where temperatures had been as high. So we were already pretty warm. This orange line is where we are now. We're 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. The point that everybody talks about that we have to avoid is 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, right? That would take us here to this red line. And if we change nothing about what we're doing, if we don't cut our emissions, then we're on track to hit 4 degrees by the end of this century, which would take us to this purple line. So what does that mean in terms of the last 65 million years? Well, if we get to 2 degrees, that will take us on this red line back the equivalent of 10 million years of planetary history, which would eventually take us to a point where we'd have a likely loss over time of all the ice on Greenland and the West Antarctic. That wouldn't happen immediately, but it would happen ultimately if we hit 2 degrees. If we don't change what we're doing, if we get to 4 degrees, which we really don't want to do, then that will take us back on this purple line, the equivalent of 40 million years in planetary history, to a point where there was no ice on Earth. And if that happened, then we would be facing 70-meter sea rises. If we go to 2 degrees, that'll be about 7-meter sea rises. Now, 70-meter sea rises is the least of our problems, because if we hit 4 degrees, then we can't survive in those temperatures. And this is something which a lot of people get a bit confused about, also at senior policy making level. We hear people talking in very senior positions about, well, we just need to adapt to a 4-degree world. People don't understand when they say that what 4 degrees means. So it's not the same as thinking about, the difference in temperature between, this week and last week, or the difference in temperature from the morning to lunchtime. We have much bigger changes in temperature in those times. This is much more like the temperature of your body. And this is something we've really learned to be aware of in the last year since COVID-19. So the normal temperature of our bodies is 37 degrees. If we get to 38 degrees, then that's classed as a fever. If we rise 2 degrees above our normal body temperature, then our lives are in danger. If we get 4 degrees above our normal body temperature, that's very bad news. Most of us can't survive that. Okay, so why is all this happening? It's happening because of greenhouse gas emissions. This chart shows us 800,000 years of history. And it shows us CO2 concentrations and temperatures. And there's a one-to-one correlation between temperatures and CO2 levels. And if we go again to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and we see that the CO2 concentrations were 280 parts per million. Since then, CO2 concentrations have gone up through the roof, and now we're at 416 parts per million. And that's a level of CO2 concentrations that simply hasn't been seen in the last 800,000 years. All right, so where's it all coming from? This is world greenhouse gas emissions in 2016, in 1 year. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the sector, the source of the emissions. And you can see that this yellow and orange chunk here, this is energy. Energy is by far the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by agriculture, so where we get our food from, how we grow our food, and then land use change and forestry. Now over here on the right-hand side, the grey section are the gases. So the biggest one that we talk about is CO2, and then methane and nitrous oxides. So I want to talk now about some of those innovations and ideas and technologies that people talk about, which people are so hopeful about for giving us a path out of climate change, like the electric vehicles and improvements in building efficiency. And I'm going to talk about why those are not enough. So first of all, electric vehicles. So at the top here we have, in the energy sector, transportation. So transportation accounts for 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And road accounts for 12%. So let's put that in context. Right now, there are about 1.5 billion vehicles on the road. So that's buses, trucks, trains, cars, motorbikes. Does anybody know how many electric vehicles we're adding every year? Not hybrids, but electric vehicles, like Teslas. Anybody want to guess?
1,000? 100,000?
Have you seen my presentation before?
No.
So it's between 1 and 200,000 EVs are added every year. So compare that with 1.5 billion vehicles that are already on the road. I mean, that's a tiny increment. It's a very, very small, almost insignificant difference, adding electric vehicles. And unfortunately, if you were to get a Tesla, does anybody here have a Tesla? If you were to get a Tesla, when you charge your Tesla, if the electricity that you're getting is coming from burning fossil fuels, then you're not lowering your carbon footprint at all, you're actually raising it. And in Hong Kong, that's exactly what happened. The Tesla managed to raise the carbon footprint of Hong Kong. Okay, let's move on to something else. So another thing that people talk about is improving energy efficiency in new buildings. So that you don't need any extra energy to heat or cool the building. Bill Gates is talking about green concrete, so concrete that actually sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. All that sounds great, but again, if you think about the existing stock, for every building that is constructed using those new techniques, there are 1 million buildings which are already there or are being constructed which aren't using those new techniques. And so again, that's a really tiny increment which isn't going to make a difference to that existing problem. And if we look then, speaking of construction, if we look at the combined output of cement and iron and steel, that accounts for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not going to be affected at all by having fancy types of cement that draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is only going to be happening in a tiny number of buildings. And it won't be affected even if there's an energy efficient building with insulation. So again, these are tiny increments which aren't addressing all of this massive problem which is interlinked. And that's not the whole problem. So the total output, the total stock of greenhouse gas emissions in 2016 was 49.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. Wildfires last year in California, Siberia, and Australia added an extra gigaton on their own. And of course, that's adding then to the whole climate change problem and the whole climate change cycle. We've talked about the problems with less ice, we've talked about the problems with permafrost. And none of those are going to be affected by electric vehicles or impact investment. All right, closer to home again, let's talk about Taiwan. So Taiwan's energy mix is overwhelmingly dominated by fossil fuels, 93%. And nearly 80% is coal and oil, and around 15% is natural gas. There is a plan to, yes please, thanks, thank you. There's a plan to build in 20% of renewables into that mix by 2025. And there are some really impressive expansion plans to increase wind capacity in Taiwan by 2030. So let's step back a little bit and think about that. I want to talk about the semiconductor manufacturing industry. Semiconductor manufacturing it's extremely important to Taiwan. It's important for Taiwan's economy, for engineering, employment, for geopolitical strategic importance, but it uses a huge amount of energy. In the last 2 years, TSMC has been breaking records for power consumption. Now, a lot of the reason for that is the increase in manufacturing of the 5 nanometer chips. But they've reported a 25% year-on-year increase in power consumption just in the last 2 years. They have been trying to increase energy efficiency, but in 2019, their power consumption, TSMC's power consumption, exceeded their own targets by 30%. So even for this engineering titan, it's extremely difficult for them to make the transition to energy efficiency. And it's going to be difficult for increases in renewable energy to keep pace with those massive increases in industrial demand, but also increases in wider demand as temperatures rise. So last summer, temperatures in Taiwan broke records, but actually so did power consumption. So let's talk about natural gas. So at the moment, the share of natural gas in the mix is 15%. Thank you. That's planned to rise to 50% by 2025. But we were talking at the beginning about the Taiwan LNG terminal, which is facing some opposition on environmental grounds because of the Datan algal reef. So the point that I want to make here is that all of this shows how extremely complex Taiwan's energy challenge is, and how complex it is to change to a low carbon economy. And that's before we start to talk about geopolitics, about isolation from international bodies like the OECD or the International Energy Agency, the reliance on imported fuel. Taiwan imports about 98% of its fuel. And what's really important to remember about this is, although Taiwan has some particular challenges, this is actually representative of the challenges that other countries around the world are facing in making that transition to a low carbon economy. The existing infrastructure, it's already there, and we're already tied into it in so many ways. So it's very, very difficult to simply make a transition to renewables or to a low carbon economy. Okay, why aren't societies responding as they should? None of this information is actually new. That's kind of the shocking thing here. We've known for decades about climate change, about how serious it is, about how urgent it is. And that information has been communicated in excellent and very clear ways to policymakers, to business leaders, again, for decades. I've personally been part of that communications push for the last 10 years. My career has been all about trying to identify and then communicate as clearly as possible this evidence to policymakers. And my ex-colleagues and my husband's ex-colleagues, some very, very experienced climate scientists, many of whom have been working for the last 40 years to communicate this information to the highest levels of decision-making, policy-making, and business. And they haven't listened. And so this is the question that's really dominated my research is why? Why are they not listening? Why are societies not making the changes necessary to avoid catastrophe? And the fact is that it's because societies are choosing not to make those changes. Societies are choosing not to fix it. And when I found this out, I thought, I must be wrong, but I'm not. Societies are deciding to prioritize something other than fixing climate change. There are two things that societies are really fixed on and which is stopping global society from changing. Economics and individualism. When I talk about economics, I don't mean about the whole subject of economics, right? That's huge. I'm talking about one specific economic worldview, which is called neoclassicism or neoliberalism. And it's this focus on growth above all things, on economic growth. And there is a direct correlation between economic growth and climate change. Because if societies want to have economic growth, they need to increase their output. That means increase their production, their productivity. They need to produce more stuff. That's what economic growth is. To produce more stuff, they need energy. To get energy, they burn fossil fuels. And if you burn fossil fuels, then you produce carbon emissions. You produce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a direct correlation between economic growth and climate change. The other issue that really gets in the way is individualism. And by this, I mean, this is a strengthening of the idea that the individual matters more than society. And that's something that's been encouraged by social media and big corporates, so that people view their individual rights as more important than the long-term well-being of everybody else. And you can see this in Europe and America today, and we've seen it in the last year, with this people fighting against lockdown restrictions and mask wearing, because they've been taught to care more about their own personal comfort and their own personal needs than society. And so that's really a huge barrier to change. All right, let's talk about what is needed. Rapid change. We need rapid change and radical change more than we have ever seen in our lifetimes, and certainly more than has been talked about in mainstream society. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 7% a year, this year, next year, the year after, until we've cut them by more than 60% by 2030 and zero emissions by 2040. We need to reform agriculture. So that means localizing it, and that means no more use of the fertilizers and pesticides that use so many nitrates. We need to stop all deforestation everywhere. And at the same time as all of this, we need to be building hundreds of carbon capture and storage plants to suck carbon out of the atmosphere that's already been released. So remember, think back to that chart that I showed you about 800 years of temperatures and CO2 levels. And remember that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were at 280 parts per million, and we're now at 416 parts per million. We need to be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere to a point probably of around 350 parts per million. That's what is generally viewed as safe levels. So we need to be not putting out any more carbon, no greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time drawing it down. Now, when I used to talk about this before COVID-19, people would say, "You're crazy. Like, that's not possible. It's just not possible. Are you serious? Or you're going to pay people to stay at home and not work? Are you going to stop all production? You're going to keep all planes on the ground and stop all flights?" But then along came COVID-19, and actually last year, that's exactly what we did. So COVID-19 has actually shown us that there is a way to pay people not to go to work and to print money to pay for that transition, to not have planes flying, to not have stuff being produced. And last year, global greenhouse gas emissions were cut by 7%. So that's great news. This is the best news I've had in 20 years. It's possible. So we just need to carry on doing more of that. Now, of course, most economies are now talking, I shouldn't use the word economy, I should use countries. Most countries are now talking about the post-COVID economic recovery. Everybody wants to push hard on the gas pedal and get back to economic growth. But that's exactly what we can't do. All right, so let's talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19. COVID-19 taught us in Taiwan, not in most other countries, that we need to act quickly Taiwan acted really fast when COVID-19 came along, shutting down the borders, putting in place mask requirements, telling people to work from home, implementing social distancing, stopping people from leaving and coming back. And that rapid response was a key reason why Taiwan has managed to control the virus. And that will be essential in acting to stop climate change. We learned also the importance of a collective response, not an individual response, and clear directions. It wasn't up to us as individuals to wear the mask. It wasn't up to us whether we practiced social distancing or stayed at home. And we had very kind of scale that we need. And so I think Taiwan engineering know-how can be really valuable in that. Energy storage is also very underdeveloped and restricts the the efficiency of energy generation, especially with renewables. When wind blows, for example, it's not always the time that we need the energy, and sometimes we need the energy, but the wind's not blowing. So advances in energy storage will also be very important. And battery technology there are all sorts of problems with that. Hydrogen fuel cells show a lot of potential, but they're still underdeveloped at scale, especially at scale. This is one of the few really green, clean, renewable energies. So there's a lot of potential there as well. Smart metering and installation will be a very quick and easy way to improve energy efficiency in buildings, and you can do that in existing building stock. And then new forms of farming that use less water and fewer fertilizers and better engineered seeds. So there are a lot of ways that Taiwan can help provide leadership and technology and know-how in the transition to a low-carbon, ecologically sustainable future. So Taiwan has a lot of experience and opportunities for climate leadership, and COVID-19 has actually increased that. Climate change is a very large and very complex and urgent problem, and there are lots of barriers to change. But Taiwan has a unique mix of experience and values, which mean that it can really help in that sustainability transition. So for the first time in 20 years, I'm hopeful. Thank you.
Okay, only say thank you for the talk, and then round floor is open for everyone asking questions, please. John, want to go first?
Yes, I'll start. I'm John Liu from New Sociology. So thank you for your talk, and you cover a large ground and really interesting talk. And I had basically a double barrel, two questions. So first, you rely very heavily on secondary sources, right? And I'm curious where kind of your research plan moving forward. I mean, because you didn't really show as much the research you have conducted, or the kind of how the data you collected or you plan to collect, and how do you arrive? We would love to hear how Taiwan can help. That's a conclusion people like. But how do you arrive in that argument, right? So first of all, your research methodology and kind of the way moving forward. And secondly, can you help us try to locate the kind of academic community that you're trying to speak with? Because a lot of people critiquing economic growth, a lot of people critiquing human geographers too, sociologists too, kind of what is the main kind of literature that you work with and kind of before and in your future plan? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Okay, so where the information has come from it's been a very, very long journey, looking at personal experiences and career experiences, which started with working in the business community and trying to get people interested in climate change issues, and being pushed back at every point. Unless I was able to talk about how people were going to make money, nobody wanted to hear about climate change or the environment. And so from that point, I started looking at the way that economic thinking has developed. And that's, thank you for bringing this along, that really helps me. That's actually been the content of a lot of the book that I just published last year with my husband, which was about the role that economics plays in, or economic ideology plays in stopping the transition, stopping us from doing the sensible thing. That's a theme that I also explored in my PhD thesis. So there are a lot of all sorts of very interesting and innovative ideas that have been explored over a couple of decades to try and stop deforestation. For example, in Indonesia, where I did my PhD thesis. But none of them has worked, and I started to realize that people get really tied up in the technological solutions and the managerial solutions, and they forget about the incentives that people have for not making changes. And so that's really the angle that I sort of came into this from. As far as my research plans go, I have a kind of a two-pronged research plan to look, again, more deeply into the barriers to change. And I work very closely with the ideas of an Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who, a few people are nodding around the room, that's nice, who was, sorry?
Germany.
No, Germany, exactly. He was looking at the ideas of Germany and common sense, and the way that people are able to have conflicting logics in their heads, which didn't appear to conflict with their own internal logic. So that's the kind of research direction I am really passionate about. And then the potential for Taiwan to make a difference, because Taiwan's really stood out in the last year as a kind of beacon of logic and sense. And so I'm fascinated to explore what are the conditions in Taiwan that make that possible, as opposed to other countries where I really expected people to be doing better. I expected better from Germany and from Austria. And oh, don't get me started on Britain, it's just too depressing. The academic community that I am speaking to is as broad as my presentation. I am, and you know, again, with this book, I've been speaking to anybody who will listen and anybody who is interested and concerned about climate change. And that's a very, very broad school, and I found that talking within economic, academic disciplines excludes a lot of very important discussions. So I strategically and deliberately try to straddle different, not just academic disciplines, but also outside academia. That's something that I think is really important. A lot of really excellent and very, very important academic work stays within academic institutions, and it gathers dust and it doesn't get the light of day that it needs. So I want to be really part of bringing that into the daylight and helping people see it.
Okay, everyone, next question, and then the JD, and then the Thomas. Okay, please. Let me first.
So you identify two reasons for the climate change. One is the economics, and the other is the individualism. And you talk about several examples for the economic aspects. How about individualism? So are you promoting to have less individualism, or do you try to get around with that problem?
No, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. I'm definitely promoting less individualism because I've seen how damaging it has been, particularly in the COVID crisis, but also before then. This is a very difficult discussion actually to have in Western societies, because the rights of the individual, it's like something religious. People have to have their individual rights. And I understand that, but we tend to forget the priority, which is to not die, to not have a climate change run completely out of control so that everybody dies. And that, I think, is a lot more important than the freedoms of individuals. But a second point is that I've lived in societies where there is a very high degree of individualism. And I've lived in societies where there is much more of a collective responsibility and a responsibility to society. And it's much more pleasant living in a country where people look after each other and look out for each other and respect each other. I lived in Switzerland before coming here. It's one of the most individualistic societies I've ever lived in. And it was horrible. People were so mean and so angry. And so I actually can't see anything to recommend a culture of individualism. It doesn't make me popular when I talk about this in Western countries. And actually, that's another problem that really comes up, actually. People in many societies are very bonded to these ideas, and that's going back to Gramsci as well. It's this hegemony of the ideology. And so they get very angry when they're faced with the idea that we want to take away their freedoms. So that's also another challenge.
Okay. Anyone? That's all. Want to ask questions?
I think you're now, and your recommendation is that we should know the fact and communicate and act. I feel that this is kind of an enlightenment project. No? What do you think?
Some people might say that the Enlightenment started us on this very bad road to climate change, because from the Enlightenment came these ideas about individual freedom and property and the Industrial Revolution. So, yeah, that's a term to be wary of. But yes, I mean, I think one of the big challenges that we face, we as a global society and we as climate activists or climate scientists, is misinformation or false information. It's very easy for people to get the wrong idea about climate change or to think that it's a hoax if they follow Donald Trump on Twitter, but you don't even have to go that far. There are a lot of people, even within my own friendship group, even within my own family, who say, well, climate change isn't that serious, right? I mean, we've got time still, and what about all the people who got it wrong in the past? And so it's very easy if you don't know the facts to get knocked down by climate deniers or climate skeptics or people who simply have an incentive to not want to change. So yeah, I think that learning the facts is the first thing that people need to do if they really want to make a big difference.
Can we distinguish facts and false alarms? Because facts are actually constructed.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. And false alarms?
Huh?
Did you say and false alarms?
False alarms. Right?
Yeah.
Both are constructed, right? Social right?
Mm-hmm.
Can we distinguish these two?
So I'm not quite sure I understand that so can we distinguish between fact and false alarms, so fiction or things that are not actually
right, fiction and
fact. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's very difficult for lay people, for non-experts, to sift through all the information and find the facts. I mean, it's taken me and my inner circle years to learn what the facts are, and we're still in a learning process. One of the things that the climate deniers or climate skeptics or people with incentives, disincentives to change, like to do is to focus on the false alarms and say, well, that event, you guys said that was climate change and it wasn't. So it's important to look at the long-term trends. It's important to look at the big picture, and that's what I did also, that's what I tried to do in this presentation. you can always take one or two data references and say, well, that doesn't work. But if you're going to take all of it, you're going to take 10 data points, you're going to say that every extreme weather event or every piece of information is wrong, that's a lot harder to push back against. So there will inevitably, I think, be some false starts or false alarms. There will inevitably be some points of data that are later proven to maybe be less perfect than they could have been. But we need to look at the big picture. And we need to be not afraid to push back against the people who say, well, is it really that serious? And say, look, yes, it's really that serious. It's been that serious for a long time. Let's stop making apologies for our science and push forward and do something. And there's a really great cartoon that I love. It's a big conference hall. And somebody's saying, what if it's all a hoax and we make the world a better place for nothing? I mean, what we're talking about is actually improving society and living more in balance with nature and having a better future for everybody. That sounds like a better thing anyway to me. So, yeah.
Maybe
Can I follow up on, especially on your key argument, because I want to understand your how you arrive in economics and individualism. So going back to Professor Chen's question on individualism, quick question on how do you measure the thing? As a sociologist, I find it extremely difficult to measure individualism. That's question number one. Question number two, your economic argument happens to be something I care deeply about too, right? So if students have taken my course, we know we spend a lot of time talking about ecological modernization versus treadmill production, etc. So now the current debate is, there on the one hand, there's the degrowth camp. Their economic growth is too much. We need to limit the economic growth, and it seems to be hinting on that point. On the other hand, we have the Green New Deal camp, right? So we need a strong government and lots of public investment so that we can get things going to combat climate change. These two camps, at least in my academic conferences, they fight with each other, right? And although they seem to be both radical and critical, but they don't get along very well. So if you want to, any comments on this debate?
Yes.
I'd love
yes.
to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, when you're talking about these two camps fighting with each other, I'm kind of reminded of religion. Christian religion, Catholics and Protestants, if you ever get them in the same room together, they'll fight, even though they actually believe in the same God. And there's something similar here going on with, the Green New Deal people and the degrowth people. Essentially, they want the same outcome, but they just have different paths to get there. The difficulty with degrowth and with circular economics, I think, is the time that it takes to get there. I mean, there's a lot of idealism that's talked about in decoupling resource use from economic growth. There's a lot that's left to generalisms. And very few degrowth people that I talk to have any clear plans about how they're going to scale that up very quickly and on a very wide scale. The Green New Deal idea, again, not perfect by any stretch, and I think probably doesn't do enough to look at the embedded, very, very damaging economic activities, particularly the fossil fuel industry, which are not being disincentivized by those deals. But the idea of creating alternative economic sectors for people and alternative jobs and an alternative development plan that is low carbon, yeah, absolutely. And actually, governments are really the only ones who can do that kind of thing at the scale that's necessary and authorize the printing of the money that is necessary to do it. Companies can't do that because their job is to make money for their shareholders. So I think Green New Deal has a lot more potential than degrowth or circular economics.
Thanks
for the question. Individualism. Yes. How to define it scientifically
How do
is...
we say Taiwan is less individual than Switzerland?
Observation.
My mother lives in Switzerland.
Oh, does it really? And what is it?
Switzerland, and there's, there's different culture. Each canton has very,
You're right, yes.
very specific. How do we know what you say? Individualism is the problem. How do we understand if we cannot measure this thing correctly?
You're right. I mean, your point also about different cantons is correct. I mean, I lived last in Zurich, and then before that I lived in Geneva. People are more... They have a different culture in Geneva, and in the Italian part, they also have a different culture. So you're right. I mean, it is a generalization, but I would be very interested also to learn from you and speak more with you about how to define that for my future research.
I think Professor Komodo has a way to identify it. So you can ask.
Yes.
Great.
We had, because we started a bit late, so we have the final two questions. Sophia first from Philippines. Yes.
So, like, looking at the nature of the problem of COVID and of climate change, like, I feel like the response to, like, the Western response is, like, pretty much vaccines are the only way to go forward now because they skip the prevention stage, whereas Taiwan, like, kind of can take their time on the vaccine because there's barely any cases here. So is it kind of good? Do you think that there will be the same kind of outcome as the solution to the reaction to climate change, where like Taiwan may somehow get ahead of the world in like responding to the thing, and then like the rest of the world will just kind of have to react and like kind of adapt instead of mitigate? Is that kind of the path in which it's going, especially considering like with COVID, everybody like unequivocally sees like that there is still a future without COVID. Like everybody's looking forward to this summer because of the vaccines. Like, so with that complication, is this where we're headed?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of similarities there. I mean, I spoke to my sister last week, and she told me she booked a summer holiday, and she lives in England. I mean, that seems insane to me. But I think that your analogy is a very good one. Taiwan can repeat the sort of pattern of behaviour it showed before and do all the right things. But then we're only 24 million people, right? And so the effect that we can really have by cutting our emissions is very low. But the effect that we can have in terms of influence may be higher. The positive thing I see is that there is a growing awareness of climate change. I mean, we saw the picture of people painting the roads white in Los Angeles is an example of that kind of reactive behaviour, but the desperation. But I think we are going to see also a real split the way that we did with COVID, where some people say, hey, there's a serious problem coming, and other people say, nah, it's not really a serious problem at all. So yes, I think that is going to be the danger.
Anyone other questions? Maybe maybe I do the last question about, since your the research for your presentation today is about the implication from the COVID experiences, and then say something about the CO2 reduction can be possible because of the COVID can tell us. But actually, we haven't tell the dark side of the COVID experiences. Actually, the society almost barely survived is because of the huge subsidy from the government. So a lot of the U.S. government and many governments spending the money, and then another issue about the infractions. That's one thing you must put into the considerations. So I was wondering, I kind of agree with you. Last year, our CO2 reduction has been hugely happening, but that is a lot of another side. The government has been spending their money to subsidize the people, and then they also has why a lot of the economic activity, even the education, can still possibly to happen online, is because of another industry taking the advantage for some of innovation. So how can you gather together to say the bigger story of the experiences of what we can learn from the COVID, rather than just only say that happened in last year?
I mean, COVID-19 COVID-19 is not the answer, but it does show us that an alternative path is possible, and that's a huge difference from where we were a year ago. A year ago, people were saying it's not possible. Now there has been a shift in the logic. I'm glad you mentioned inflation as well. That is something that a lot of people are terrified about. But it's the lesser of two evils. Inflation is something which can be managed. Climate change, runaway climate change isn't. So I think we're pretty smart. We can manage to find a way to deal with inflation. You talked about the reason we were able to do what we did last year is because the government was paying for it. The same thing needs to continue. The governments are subsidising fossil fuel industries massively and always have done. And there are many other dirty industries that are being subsidised. So there's money that can be shifted. And there's a lot of talk about releasing at Davos recently. People talk about releasing the financing to help stimulate innovation in climate-friendly technologies. There is a willingness to create the financing for all these things, but we've been funding that in the wrong direction. So with all our smart minds, I think we can really manage the economic problems. But if we let the climate problem get away from us, then our economies will also be touched.
All right, we say thank you once again.